All right, so we just got done talking to Dr. Colin Gillin about captive cervids, and I got to be honest, Aaron, I feel like at the end of that conversation, we're the kids in public school, and the captive cervid industry are private school kids sitting at the lunch table with caviar, poking holes in all of our dodgeballs. What about you?
That's an interesting way to think about it. I concur in that it just seems like an egregious, maybe scheme's too big of a word. Just the fact that the thing is built on the back of public wildlife and that it continues to go on and pose threats to public wildlife and our sporting way of life. And just the whole thing just is still kind of mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it's crazy. I take a listen because it's a wild story.
Yeah, and at least we had one of the leading experts on this. Again, we're lucky we keep getting these people who have lived and breathed this stuff for a long time, and we cover all kinds of stuff. High fence hunting, what exactly is a captive cervid? What do the farms do? What do they sell? How they work? How does the USDA and APHIS, monitor these things and transportation? So I think we cover a lot of things that people are going to be interested in. And again, another aspect of CWD that we're hoping to help folks unpack. Chronic wasting disease, an always fatal and definitely complex neurological disease afflicting cervids across North America and beyond.
More than 50 years after its discovery, the impacts of this disease are ramping up quickly, while hunters are having to make tough decisions about how they hunt and feed their families.
What does this mean for the future of big game hunting? What can be done to stop the spread and conserve our hunting traditions?
The Chronic Wasting Disease Chronicles explores these issues with leading experts from around the country and looks hopefully to a future full of healthy, wild cervid populations.
Brought to you by NWF Outdoors and Artemis. Welcome to the Chronic Wasting Disease Chronicles.
Today we're going to be talking captive cervids. I am your host, Ashley Chance, and I'm joined by my co-host, Aaron Kindle. Hey, Aaron.
How's it going, Ashley? How you doing today?
Good. I'm excited to start this conversation and hear what Dr. Gillin has to tell us.
Yeah, me too.
Today we're sitting down with Dr. Colin Gillin, who is a state wildlife veterinarian for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he's been active in national efforts to monitor and slow the spread of CWD for decades. He's worked as part of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Health Committee, and he currently serves as a leader of the Wildlife Health Committee and a co-editor for the National Guidance on the Best Management Practices for the Surveillance and Response of CWD. Really, it's the gold standard for how everyone should be approaching the management of CWD. So, Colin, welcome. We're really excited to talk to you today.
Great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, one of the things that I think I would like to know more about, especially if you feel like you can speak to it, is the notion of a captive cervid. So we talk about cervids as being species of deer, elk, moose, caribou. In my mind, these are all wild animals.
They are. There's lots of definitions for captive cervids, and the different states and provinces, as well as those that hold captive cervids, they all have various definitions of what they are. And basically, we're in North America. We're talking about deer and elk, North American deer and elk, and they're legally acquired. And they're held either as or on private property for personal use, or use by others that may come in and pay money or for their use for harvest or for the products. And that's basically what they are. They're regulated by all jurisdictions, state or provinces at some level.
How did that start, Colin? We were sitting here thinking about this. Originally, these critters were wild critters. They got them somewhere. How did it come about that at one point someone could take something out of the wild, put it in a pen, and then treat it as livestock?
It started decades ago, if not hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Deer farming, in particular, started hundreds of years ago in Eurasia, and it goes back that far. And we had farmed, if you will, or captively held cervids. We had fallow deer at the time of Thomas Jefferson, even. So it goes back quite a ways. The holding of captive cervids, deer and elk, really picked up since the 1960s and 70s. And there were a variety of movements through agriculture to improve the value and of land, improve the value of what you could do on those lands by farmers and those that had property that could be used for agricultural purposes, and it started to organize, and it organized into what we've seen today. It's evolved over time through meat markets and other products, and become quite commercialized in lots of areas of the country. So that's kind of the short of it all. It's been a process.
So this is interesting to me. It sounds like deer farming predates the North American model of conservation.
It does. It does quite a bit. And we've had deer farming. We've had captive wildlife holding in the form of ungulates and cervids for quite some time. The holding of North American species has also been going on probably for at least the last 30 years plus. But as I said, it's really picked up over that time through a lot of the use of agricultural market techniques, as well as organized organizations that help these different industries out. There's a North American Elk Breeders Association that's quite organized and very helpful, as well as there's a North American Deer Farmers Association that is likewise very engaged with those that breed and use North American deer and elk for commercial purposes.
So we're talking about farming elk or deer or moose, presumably. I mean, maybe someone does that. I've never heard of that. But let's talk about what the rules are. Like, how are these governed? What are they? What kind of rules do they have to live by to hold these wild cervids or captive cervids?
Yeah, sure. Well, the rules are varied, and some of them are quite. They're quite detailed. Those that regulate heavily, or from a state standpoint, or in conjunction with the USDA, have a variety of things that they cover. I can just give you an example. A state will define, the types of animals. They may break them into types. Where one type is North American cervids, and another type that they may regulate even differently, very differently, are those that are not endemic, and there's no chance that they're actually gonna, if they got loose, would breed with North American species. They regulate the number, they regulate the facility size, of course, and fencing requirements, which is very, very important. Such things as real important things such as import and export, as well as transporting animals across either within the state or province or across state lines. And then some states, Oregon is one of those, that the agency that I work for, we prohibit hunting of captive cervids. And so cervids that are in our state, and there's other states that do this, where you do not allow shooter bucks or shooter bulls. It's primarily a meat market or a backyard mom and pop industry, which we have more of those than we do of those that use deer, that use elk for meat purposes. There's also things covered as far as release, say escape, and probably most important is disease testing, which is why we're having this conversation. In some of these programs, that if they do have captive cervids, they try to set their regulations up with the USDA such that the state regulations mesh with the herd certification program for having certified herds that are of low risk of having CWD by the USDA. But that's just a handful of stuff. It's things that a lot of agencies would do if they had a similar industry. You're looking at everything from permits, because most of these are permitted or licensed, and so you require animal ID, just like some states do for livestock, as well as inspection, and that kind of thing. So I kind of rambled on there, but there's a variety of things that the rules can cover and regulate, and it's important for states to have those in place. I know when our state was putting together and updating our rules and regulations, I pulled in every regulation from every state to try to select the best practices for putting together administrative rules to support our statutes on captive cervid holding.
So we're talking about rules put in place by who? I mean, does it differ from state to state who's in charge of making and enforcing these rules for captive facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there is. It varies. In some states, the Department of Fish and Wildlife or Department of Natural Resources in those states regulate their captive cervid industry. In other states, it's the Department of Agriculture. And quite often when it is regulated through the Department of Agriculture, which is often determined by the legislative branch of that state, those animals are determined to be livestock by definition within that state. The rules can be regulated or held, or the industry can be regulated by both Department of Natural Resources and Agriculture, where you cover different aspects from say for quarantine or disease. Perhaps the Department of Agriculture covers that because the state vet is involved in that with all species of animals, where all the other parts of regulating the facilities within that state could be actually regulated or addressed through the Department of Natural Resources.
Thanks for that, Colin. Another thing I wanted to touch on before we leave the kind of mechanics of the farms, if we call them farms, I guess, is the kind of products. You mentioned meat, but I think we've all heard horror stories too about some of the stuff that comes out of these places, whether it be urine or semen or velvet or different things that comes out of these places. And maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the different products that come out, and then how that is problematic for the management of CWD. I can think of, if you're taking bodily fluids anywhere, obviously with something like CWD that's transferred by a prion that comes out from saliva and other bodily fluids, you could potentially be spreading it. Is that inaccurate, or maybe you can just expand on that?
Yeah, the products are a concern for the spread of CWD. There are quite a few things that are tied to that. As you were asking this question, I was thinking the products are related to the type of farms there are. Um, and what type of facilities there are. Because I mentioned the mom and pop facilities, they're generally a handful of animals, and they're not producing any products or shipping anything per se. And some states have quite a few of these, and like I said, in Oregon, we in other states, surrounding states, we have very few farms that are not mom and pop. But there's those that produce meat and products. They produce things such as we have a couple farms in the region that just do tours to the public, which is more or less a mom and pop type facility. I mean, you're not worried about CWD as much in a place that's not receiving animals or transporting animals. And then there's breeding facilities. That's a type of product, if you will. Some of those products that they come out of breeding facilities and are used in breeding facilities are semen that are collected from bucks and bulls, and then sold to other farms, either within that state or jurisdiction or around the country. So other products that we may worry about as far as that could be carried in biological products would be urine. It's a huge concern for a lot of states. There's a handful of states that ban urine products because of the threat of having CWD in those products. So they only allow either no urine products or they only allow synthetic. And then other products that could be of concern are antler velvet. And there's a variety of things that go through and can be made out of antler products. There's extract, there's drops, there's say freeze-dried products, sprays, and the advertisements for these are for such things as treating high blood pressure, treating asthma, athletic performance, all sorts of things. There's a whole list of things that antler velvet at least is claimed to be used for. And so antlers themselves, of course, we've seen these in the pet stores with chew toys from antlers.
Crafting.
Yeah, crafting. Antlers for just things like antler art and furniture is huge, particularly in the Rocky Mountain West. We see that a lot with elk antlers, and of course, and then there's hides and leather products. That anything that can be made out of a hide with cows can be made with elk hides or deer hides. I mean, all those products are potentially of some concern. We worry about urine, feces, saliva, primarily as being more of a risk, and then of course anything that has nerves in it or is neurologically connected, like the brain or the spinal cord, lymph nodes, things like that.
So talking about all of these products, something else that strikes me as relevant is services, right? Like when we talk about captive facilities, it's not just farms, it's also what I would call a high fence operation where you can pay to go, quote unquote, hunt a fenced animal. And I grew up on a farm. I'm pretty familiar with fences, how to build them, how to fix them, because when you have a fence, it will fail. And granted, the fence that we have to keep cattle in, when I was growing up, looks a lot different than, hopefully, the fences that are required for these facilities. But it strikes me that, like you said, these products are of some concern when it comes to the spread of CWD, but I feel like the animals themselves being moved around or having the opportunity to escape is a bigger risk. I mean, can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, the escape of animals is It's always a risk, and there's no state that doesn't have escaped animals. Some states have documentation that of the ones they can document of hundreds of escapes a year, and so that's concerning. And whether or not as part of many of the rules, it's what to do if you can or cannot get those animals back in the fence, and that sort of thing. As far as high fence operations go, it's used in a variety of ways. By definition, all of the captive cervid facilities are high fence operations. They're enclosures, of 8 foot, at least 8 foot enclosures, 8 foot fences. Some of them are double fenced, to keep animals coming nose to nose with the wild counterparts on the outside, which could pass disease into their herd, or of course the state worries about things coming from a captive herd out. And high fence operations also, used for the part of the industry that takes part in trophy hunting, and the hunting of animals behind a high fence is one of the things that we hear a lot about from the public, particularly those that are either kind of on the fence, no pun there, but about whether or not they they like hunting or not, but they tend to equate hunting with what goes on behind high fence operations, where they've read or seen where on the online where animals are basically harvested in an area where there is no fair chase, and they equate that with all hunting. So hunting behind high fence operations, has the potential to give the public a misperception on what legal and fair chase hunting is all about, and that's what the DNRs and state agencies are all about.
Let's just pull back the curtain a little bit more on that, Colin. I think you're being pretty nice there, and let me talk about a couple of things that I think of that, or that I want you to help us talk about, because as we prepared for this episode, I learned some things that I was unaware of that, to me, made some of the things that we were learning even worse. For instance, high fence operations, and then you got the lack of fair chase there, right? Because these animals are in a confined space, and the other part is the commerce around this, as far as like somebody might pay $25,000 to go hunt a buck that's been raised, and perhaps raised more like a prize horse or something like this, with the genetics very specifically engineered, if you will, not technically engineered, but breeding, things like that. That to me violates so many different tenets of just ethical sportsmanship. Can you walk us through that a little bit? Because that, along with the largeness and the type of money we're talking about with this industry, was something that was really baffling to me. I thought we were talking, small operations here and there, not lots of money changing hands. Just maybe somebody rich comes along, hunts a buck at once in a while. But we've found that it's a lot more than that. And I know I just loaded you with a bunch of stuff, but maybe you can just help us understand that to a larger degree for the audience. Yeah.
Well, with a lot of these facilities, it's complex, because they're used. There's not a standard model. I guess that's the way to look at this. The animals are raised in these high fence facilities for breeding, for breeding the best genetics, and that's part of this farming, ranching concept. And let me just add that most DNR agencies and I'm just going to divert here a little bit my thoughts, is they consider deer and elk to be wildlife, and not livestock. So when I use the term farm or ranch, we're not considering them as ranches. They're still wildlife. Okay, so these animals are used when they're held in captivity by cervid operations. They're used for breeding. They're used for putting animals into hunting facilities as say stalker animals, as they're referred to in some parts of the country. And then they're used for selling or breeding animals that are specifically sold at really high prices. You referred to, Aaron, and it's these animals are fed real high protein and high mineral supplements to do nothing more than grow a tremendous rack for somebody to shoot. So these facilities can do a lot of different things. Many of them will have a breeding facility as well as a shooter facility, a shooting trophy preserve. They can have one or the other. They can be set up to where these shooting preserves actually go out to a variety of facilities to purchase, or they go through auction houses to purchase animals, and then bring them into their facilities to harvest. And some of these facilities are everything from just relatively small and not very it's not very extravagant to where they're like almost like a luxury resort. And some of those facilities are an all-inclusive type hunt where you fly in and you picked out your animal, possibly online or the like, and or through a brochure, and then that animal's put into a facility or put into a enclosed fence area, and then you harvest the animal, and you get back on your plane and fly home. And these facilities then process everything for you. So it's variable. I don't know if I answered your question completely there. It's just there's anything you can imagine, is that would work in these scenarios to make lots of money, and to make the highest profit you can, has probably been tried. The industry now, there's a lot of estimates for it of what it brings in for the people that utilize these, and it's estimated up to be about $8 billion nationally. So it's a huge, profitable industry.
That's more than I would have thought. Wow. I want to ask one more question before we leave this, Ashley. I know you're gearing up to ask a question.
You're good, yeah.
But what kind of numbers are we talking about, Colin? Because this was another shocking thing to me, like number of farms in certain states. And I know there's some of them, there's several hundred farms in a state. Can you talk about nationwide or maybe a couple of state examples?
I can give you estimates. I've looked on the USDA site, and I've looked at some of the stuff in the literature, and probably from an estimate, there are about at least 100,000 deer farms, and or not. Wow. As it was about. Let me take that back. There are about 10,000 deer farms. 10,000 deer farms in the U.S., somewhere plus or minus some amount, and they have somewhere between 230 to 200 plus upwards thousand. We're talking over 250,000 animals that are in the deer captive deer business. Wow. And I'm probably low, very low on that number, and somebody listening to this will probably call in to correct me. The elk farms are greater than 1,000 again, which we're talking more in the 1,000 numbers. There's over 100,000 elk in captivity in the U.S. and there's over 50,000 elk in captivity on these farms in Canada. So, just in the North American continent, we have over 150,000 elk, and who knows, and 250, 300,000 captive deer or more.
So as we're talking about this as big business and all the money that there is to be spent and made, I want to play out a scenario here and just kind of think through it. If I'm a high fence operation in one state and I know that there's some really great genetics a few states over that I would love to get into my herd because it's going to give me bigger antlers and thus more dollars when people come to pay to shoot these animals. I know that there's a lot of, and maybe we can get into talking about movement restrictions of live cervids. I would love for you to outline that for us. But I find it very hard to believe that in a horse trailer in the dark of night, there couldn't be deer crossing borders that they shouldn't be when there's this much money on the line. And I'm going, this is an aside now, but this pisses me off. Like, as a hunter, as somebody who wants to be respectful of the resource and take advantage of it in the way that I feel is ethical, I feel like it's being endangered by these people that just want to have a fun weekend and have the money to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, there are federal rules for interstate movement of cervids. USDA has those rules, and there are animals that are moved illegally. And I guess I mean, we all hear stories. I can tell you that I've met and I know cervid ranchers that are very upstanding people, and they try to. Yeah, I may not agree with their industry or their career choice, but they try to do the right thing. They try to do everything that you would expect them to as an agency. And then there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, let's say, and as there is in every industry. And when there's that much profit to be made, sometimes animals get moved without proper authority, without proper approval. And so we have this system in place to move animals across state lines. And it was put together by USDA through their cervid health organization, their department. And it's known as the Voluntary Chronic Wasting Disease Herd Certification Program. And they put out an annual report every year. It's usually about February. The one for this last year is not available, but it's an APHIS National CWD Herd Certification Program, if you will. And this program was implemented back in 2014. So prior to that, there wasn't anything. It's a voluntary federal and state, as well as, of course, industry cooperative program. And it's implemented by, those states that want to be part of it, basically. Some states do, some states don't. And it's put together so that you can come up with a herd that is known to be low risk, certified as low risk. You go through this program, and then it's not no risk. They can only be low risk. And then if you meet all the standards of the program, which take 5 years to get to, then your herd becomes known as certified low risk. And during that 5 years, you're monitored by the state, and you go through a certain standard of inspections, and the state has to agree to this and actually perform those inspections, and basically test everything to make sure that they have no CWD over this 5-year period, and they're monitored to be CWD free. If you get a positive during that time, then it kicks you back, and it takes quite a bit longer to get certified if you want to stay in the program. So that's it sounds good. Like that's they're on the right track, and they are. I guess I don't have any complaints with the concept if you're going to have captive cervids. It's just that the program has problems, and those problems is that we keep coming up with positive CWD animals in certified low herds. And these are animals that are moved around primarily in state often, or they could be just herds that test negative as certified negative every year for 10 plus years and then become positive. So it's a program that really needs to be looked at and reevaluated, and by an outside source to come up with how to make the captive cervid industry safer from a disease standpoint. Right now, the program standards are put together by the USDA and the Cervid Health Program folks, as well as stakeholders, which include the captive cervid industry. The states also had a say-so in that, but the rules are really written for the client, for the captive cervid owner. And but I go back to that. I can maybe just give you some numbers just off the top of my head.
Hey, Colin, before we do, can we go back real quick, because I think we used a couple of acronyms and we like to always clarify those. USDA is U.S. Department of Agriculture, and then APHIS is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services or Service, and those are the folks that are really charged with protecting agriculture and natural resources. For things like if you've ever traveled with, to Hawaii or a different country, they'll often check and, hey, you have any fruit? You have any, different things like that. I think they're connected even to things like that, right? They're folks that make sure that diseases and, pests and things like that aren't transferring.
That's true. And the rules they set up for this herd certification program is geared solely for the interstate transport. So you end up with a certified herd by jumping through these hoops, and the state agrees, and the federal government, USDA, agrees that the herd is low risk, and then they're allowed to transport animals across state lines. And so if you look at the last couple of years, these are a couple numbers that I looked up, and they if you just go back to, like I said, we don't have anything for this past year yet. It'll be coming out over the next month. But if you looked at their FY 2020, there were 22 new captive cervid herds that ended up with CWD, and of those,
that's a lot.
9 of them, it's a lot, 22. But still, they weren't all in the program. So about 9 of them were, which included 7 that were actually certified, and 2 of the herds were enrolled in the program. They hadn't quite got to 5 years, and then they ended up with a CWD positive. If you go back another year to their fiscal year 2019, there were 17 new herds, and of those, 9 were part of the herd certification program. If you go back another year to 2018, it was 15, with basically 6 part of the herd certification program. And there were 2 herds that were part of a traceback, where they were. It's interesting the way this works. It's almost like a shell game. There was an animal that became positive in one herd, and it was traced back that it came from a certified herd, and the certified herd was then tested, found to have positive animals, and it was then depopulated. So just in 2018, 15, 2019, 17, 2020, There were 22 new herds. It's increasing, and the fact that there are certified herds in there every year. This fiscal year, 2021, will be the 9th year that the program's been in place. There's not been a year that the certified herd program didn't have positives that showed up, and usually it's half of more than a dozen herds, and we question as USDA does to try to trace these things out, and it's very difficult to. But I guess all I can say is that it's a program that is not working, and it's not working for very good reason. If you move an animal that, for instance, that has some disease to another state, you treat the animal, or if it's livestock, you may euthanize the animal, and the problem usually at that point is done. Moving a CWD positive animal from one state to a state that doesn't have CWD, that state then is a CWD positive state. And it makes a difference on all sorts of things, on how you manage, how you do surveillance, the $100 that you usually spend on other programs, you're suddenly spending on tremendous amount of these resources just on surveillance, trying to see if that got out of if the positive animal transferred something through the fence and to the wild, and so it's a big deal. It's a big deal, and there shouldn't be any animals in certified herds that have been moved around ever. We don't have a lot of evidence of that, but we do have evidence. We have evidence of positive animals getting loose from herds, getting outside the fence, and then being recaptured several years later and being positive. We have animals that were moved from one state to another, and that ended up being positive. It doesn't happen a lot, and we haven't documented a lot, but it has happened, and I would guess it happens more often than we document. It's like everything.
Yeah, that sounds like a tough thing to document. I know from experience, capturing wild cervids can be quite difficult. So to try to capture a specific wild cervid to test it over a course of years, years after an escape, I think would be incredibly difficult. Colin, you talked about, the herd certification program, issues there, facilities testing positive. What happens when a facility tests positive for CWD?
Well, that facility is on lockdown, of course, right away and this is just in general terms. The different states have different things that they do from a regulatory standpoint. That herd goes under quarantine, and then what generally, at least, is hoped that would happen is that herd is depopulated and every animal tested in order to determine how widespread the disease is. We've had positive animals show up in herds that weren't depopulated for several years, and when they were finally after 18, 20, 24 months depopulated, the prevalence of that captive population was 80%. And so it can go fast. And of course, we know from listening to Matt Dunphy's talk, it's 100% fatal. It's a disease that has no vaccine. There is no cure, and it has this environmental component that facility, that captive facility, is infected for we don't know how long. To this date, we don't know how long CWD stays in the soil on these, particularly in these areas that have had animals that are shedding it, in paddocks and pastures, that it could be there for 20 plus years. We just don't have a number yet, because where it is tested and put to the test in paddocks and as well as corrals, animals become positive again, even after waiting years.
So it seems like if I'm a facility, if I even think I'm going to test positive, that's scary because all my inventory is gone. Like my livelihood is over, right? I mean, that's what it would sound like to me.
Well, if you chose not to depopulate, I mean, it again, depending on the state, you may hold on to your animals and then use them try to get some money out of them for hunting purposes, for high fence type hunting purposes. So we have several states that have positive herds right now that were not depopulated. They did not take this thing that's called indemnity, where the federal government pays, and there's a set amount of money. It's not unlimited. It's a set amount of money that they pay out to these herds. And you have to be a certified in the certified herd program also, and they will pay out through a negotiated amount per animal to that facility for them to come in and remove all the animals, the CWD positive animals, and those that may not be, but just to depopulate the facility. If you're not part of the program, you're not likely to get indemnity payments, and that could be some of the reason why some of these facilities are not taking the indemnity and depopulating, is that they're not part of the program. So in order to at least get some money back from their infected herd, they try to sell hunts.
So Colin, where's that money come from that they would pay once the herd is indemnified?
That's a good question. It's taxpayer dollars. It's federal money that is that comes from Congress, that's given to USDA, and then it's parceled out as to the different uses of it, and they spend up to $1 million a year on paying indemnity payments around the country for these positive herds.
So it's kind of subsidized. The industry is a bit subsidized in a way by that, right? Because it keeps these people hanging on who, through one mechanism or another, got CWD within their herd.
Yeah, if they're in that certified herd program, but they in no way want to get the disease, I'm sure.
Yeah,
I mean, They just don't. That's not a good way to make a living. And having to negotiate, sometimes it takes. Well, the facility was finally depopulated. It was a long negotiation period, that allowed the prevalence within that facility to go sky high. And but where you may be selling trophy bucks with tremendous racks that have been basically manufactured through selective genetics and nutrition, and that animal might have been $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 for a hunter to come in. I mean, you may be a fraction of that in the negotiation. Something that you'll have to decide if you're the facility owner you want to do or not.
Howdy, listeners. For more great content, check out NWF Outdoors social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Connect with us. We want to hear from you. Send us your ideas for podcast guests and questions in the comments.
And for even more excellent content, here's a message from our partner podcast.
Hey everyone, this is Marcia Brownlee from Artemis Sportswomen. We know you love awesome stories about hunting, fishing, and conservation, so head on over to the Artemis podcast. You'll meet adventurous, accomplished women who are redefining conservation through their lives in the field and on the water. Filled with humor, audacity, empathy, and intelligence, Artemis brings you new voices and introduces you to women from all walks of the sporting community. Find Artemis wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't want to jump to conclusions here, but when I hear all the different parts of this industry seems just a bit out of place. Like the things that it takes to keep this going, whether it be federal tax dollars or, threats to wild cervids or, the amount of monitoring and different things that has to occur. If I'm a guy and I see this and just go, hey, this just seems out of whack. I mean, what do you say to someone who thinks that? I mean, is there in your professional opinion, is there still a place for this kind of thing? Or is it something that really somehow probably shouldn't have ever been, approved in the first place?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan. This is my own opinion. A big fan of captive cervids, and it's for a variety of reasons. We look at wildlife, from the North American model of wildlife conservation, and the holding of captive cervids tends to violate that quite a bit. It violates that public trust of the public trust doctrine that wildlife belongs to the public, belongs to all of us. At the point that they're put in captivity, regardless of the regulation that oversees that industry, be it say more private property or animals that are held by the public that are at least perceived as private property and regulated one way or another through various agencies. I mean, it just violates what we think of when we think of endemic wildlife, such as white-tailed deer, mule deer, the various elk subspecies that we have in this country, and we consider those wild and free-ranging. And then at the point that they are in captivity, they're still wild, but they're not available to the public, and it tends to violate quite a few things. Hunters, the public at large, and they just need to think about the wildlife resource, and how they want it managed. And if I was a public and really dove into what captive cervid industry is all about, I would talk to my commissioners. I'd get a lot more information about it. There's a lot out there. There's the CWD is a threat to free-ranging wildlife, and we don't really know how it started on the landscape. There's some theories, but it's been out there for a long time. And the one thing that is important here is that is trying to keep CWD from spreading and from being transmitted. And the one thing that we know that we can do, and we saw this through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies best management practices, the one major thing we could do is just not move live animals. And that's for agencies, not to move free-ranging live animals, and particularly don't move captive animals. And if you're moving them anywhere, you do not want to be moving them across state lines or long distances. And it's just something that we shouldn't be doing. And it goes along with the other things we talked about with things that could carry CWD, such as urine, possibly other products. We just need to really, really think what we want to, how we want to, look at our wildlife resource and how captive animals fit into that.
Yeah. Well, you jumped the gun on us a little because I know we want to ask you a little bit more about AFWA BMPs. And there's a couple more acronyms, which I always like to spell those out because some people don't live in acronym world like we do. AFWA is the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. It's the kind of conglomerated group of all of them come together and talk about different issues across the country and try to work on big picture items. And then BMPs, obviously most people know those, best management practices. But before we go to that, one of the things you talked about was the North American model, right?
Right.
And one of the central tenets in the North American model is, you can't take wildlife and use it for market purposes. And to me, this is obviously when you're, you keep referring to these animals as wildlife, and you know more than I do about that. To me, I think once they're in that fence, it's hard for me to consider them wildlife anymore, although they're still that critter, but they're managed and treated like livestock in so many ways. And then they violate that tenet. Can you talk a little bit about that, about, how, when we have that tenet and agencies are all kind of living by that model, how are they looking at this, and how does that, kind of rub up against how they typically manage wildlife?
Yeah, that's a good question, Aaron. Really good question. If you look at the model, it actually has 7 parts to it that make the model up. And if you think about the captive cervid industry and captive wildlife, just in general, endemic wildlife in general, let's just go with the first one. Wildlife as a public trust resource. So wildlife belongs to all the people. If it's captive and somebody's claiming it's their private property, it violates that right away. The second one that was listed in the North American model of wildlife conservation is elimination of markets for game. Okay, so this right away is treating,
that one too.
It's huge, treating the game as markets. And the allocation of wildlife by law, it's not available to everybody, and so the allocation is not by law. The states do not determine that wildlife is allocated to the public that owns the wildlife. And such things as wildlife should only be killed for a legitimate purpose. Well, I've already said that there's a huge pushback that the agencies feel, and anybody that's worked in wildlife management or conservation, we've all talked to people that think that hunters out there engaging in our heritage of free chase hunting and wildlife, enjoying wildlife in the outdoors with their families, is somehow related to high fence hunting and removal of these animals that are only shot for basically the size of their antlers. Wildlife is considered an international resource. Science is a proper tool for the discharge of wildlife policy. There's not a lot of science that is driving the captive cervid industry. It's driven by profit. And when it's driven by profit, there's a lot of things that can happen with that. And you end up having, some of the not so good things that related to trafficking of animals that Ashley talked about. And so that sort of thing happens. And the last thing that's part of that model is the democracy of hunting. And of course, it involves all of us that take part in hunting and work through our commissions and work through our legislators and the process is set up through our governments. When wildlife's put behind a fence and held as private property, that just doesn't occur.
So it strikes me in talking about all of this that the captive cervid industry as a whole costs a lot to our wildlife resource and doesn't give anything to it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I asked a question with one of my colleagues the other day, and about, we were coming up with trying to think of ways that the captive cervid industry has benefited wildlife, and there are not a lot of cases. There are instances where states have determined they have a disease problem in cervids, either from import or from, say, vector-borne, from mosquitoes or gnats. There's a disease called epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and it's a big problem in the captive cervid industry. It causes high mortality and a lot of death in the animals, as well as on animals outside the fence that are free ranging. But sometimes the first sign of this epizootic hemorrhagic disease, this EHD, is in a captive cervid facility. So, and because they actually have their eyes on their animals, so that's not a good positive, particularly for the industry, but it is. And these other things that at 8 billion annually, if that's actually the number, that's adding to the economies. But again, it's not adding to wildlife conservation. It's not why we're here and what we're talking about. But it's a positive to the states and the as far as money goes and taxes.
So, Colin, I know that you helped author the AFWA Best Management Practices. Can you give us just kind of a brief overview of what some of those BMPs are? And maybe it'll be obvious how deer farms go against that, but maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah. So the AFWA Best Management Practices, we started them back in about 2017 out of the Fish and Wildlife Health Committee of AFWA. They meet several times a year. And they're based on the best available peer-reviewed science. And so what we did was we brought together over 30 of the nation's health specialists, the state veterinarians, federal veterinarians, other agency leaders, and the like, just a bunch of people that are thoroughly engaged in CWD issues and management across North America, and put together a bunch of best practices, basically, and put it into a document. And they're intended to be adaptable, and as you get new information and new things come up. So in 2000, the first iteration of this was 2018, and then 2019 we had a supplement to it. So there's actually two pieces to it now where things were added. And they're not meant to be prescriptive. They're not meant to mandate programs to agencies. They're just meant as guidance. And right at the top of the list is things like live animal movement. And this relates directly to captive cervids. But again, I said it relates to the agencies too. And it states that in order to reduce the risk and really get the most bang for your buck. I'm full of puns today, aren't I? You would prohibit all human-assisted live cervid movements. And I think everybody agrees with that, at least through the agencies and the conservation world. When you move an animal, you run huge risk of moving the zoo pathogens, a zoo of pathogens within that animal. And CWD, we know that these animals can be moved. You could test them and test them through live testing, which is one of the things that the captive cervids are tested for in these herd certification programs, and for movements and other things. But you can get a negative if the animal is at the front end of the disease. And so if animals are moved somehow and they have the disease and they're testing negative, and then they become positive, where they end up, that's a part of the program through the testing. It's not going to work. So movement of live cervids, carcass movements, there are a variety of things that are there. We had 22 chapters in that first iteration, and it covered things we've talked about, the cervid urine products that are coming from the captive industry. And the best practice there is to not allow cervid urine products. There are alternative guidelines with each of these. The alternative guideline would be to perhaps allow synthetic products. And then the import of reproductive tissues and products and gametes, like are another of the 22 chapters that relates directly to captive cervids. So it's online on the AFWA website under CWD, AFWA CWD best management practices, and it covers, again, everything from public communications to human dimensions, relevant case law, and some of that relevant case law is interesting also as it relates to CWD and captive cervids, because the case law covers several court cases in Missouri and Texas and Indiana related to who actually owns animals, whether they're behind a fence or not. And in some of the states, their courts determined that animal cervids that are endemic to the state, if they're behind a fence and held as privately and managed privately through private ownership of sorts, they still belong to the state and they can be regulated by the state. So important legislation. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll link to the BMPs in the show notes for if any interested listeners want to take a look for themselves.
You know, I let me just say that there are sections throughout the BMPs that states have latched onto that are really related specifically to captive cervids. And here's an important one that I didn't say, is that the cervid regulation or regulation of captive cervid programs should be by the State Wildlife Authority, if at all possible. And an alternative to that, of course, would at least be shared, so the state has their hand in it and they're not completely left out of it. I mean, one of the things that we do in Oregon and they do in other states out in the West and other places, any captive cervid that dies, regardless of whether the facility participates in herd certification, is tested. Every cervid that dies is tested for CWD. It's very important. And in a lot of states, they only test 10%, or they only test animals that did not go to slaughter and that kind of thing. We test everything, as do other states. Adequate fencing and barriers. Any new facilities, many states are doing this, any new facilities that come to a state, they have to double fence with, say, 8-foot fences or 10-foot for elk and 10 feet between the two fences to prevent nose-to-nose contact with wild cervids and those that are inside the fence. Animal ID and those type of things that are other chapters in there that relate directly to captive cervids, things like that. So anyway, there's quite a bit in there.
Yeah, we'll link those, Colin, and it's probably a good little bridge to one of the last things we wanted to ask you. And that is, look back on your career, look back on the 50, 60 years that CWD's been around. What's if you could say one thing should have been done differently back when relative to captive cervids or the management of CWD in this space, what do you think that is? And then maybe after that, what do you think should be done now? I'll give you 2 questions.
Well, those are good, both good questions. Early on, we had Colorado's State Wildlife Veterinarian Mike Miller. That he was telling all the states about this back in the 90s and the 80s about this chronic wasting disease that was happening, and I think the states did not, for the most part, react with enough alarm, and perhaps and since that time, states have increased their number of captive cervid facilities. I said, we have 10,000 captive deer facilities now. It was a handful of years ago. If you look online, you'll see in the popular and the peer-reviewed literature, there were 4,000 herds. So it went from 4,000 facilities to 10,000 facilities in it looks like less than 10 years. And so the industry has been increasing through all this. And so if we could have done things different, I think we would have really looked at the captive industry and thought about whether or not we allowed it or how we managed it better. It got to a point where we just were, it wasn't that we weren't paying attention, it's just that we were not acting aggressive enough. And to this day, we do a lot better with response. We all have response plans, and we have response plans for captive cervid facilities. And we have them in rule and in statute. But it would have been good to have that set up early on. And it's hard to react at an agency or state scale very quickly when it's kind of unknown what the future looks like. And so, for now I don't know. I think we all just need to really think about the disease and think about what we can learn about this disease. We all need to be better educated by it. The hunters, conservationists, the public, and the agency staff, because we're learning new things all the time. Different folks have different ideas on management strategies, and there's new science out there. And I think we need to think really what's important, as like I said, from a conservation standpoint and as hunters, and what we can do. That's we heard with Matt Dunphy in the last podcast. As a hunter, do everything you can to get on top of this. Well, you should also be doing that when you're thinking about things that might occur in your state, like captive cervids. Some states have actually limited and regulated much more their captive cervid industry. Some of them have reduced the number of facilities in their state. And there are actually a couple states that have set up their regulations that they have no new captive cervid facilities. There's multiple states that have that. So when they grandfathered in the ones that are there, of course, but when they go out of business, that'll be the end of captive cervids in those jurisdictions. I think that's really, really important. And I guess the last thing that I think that we should really think about is to really evaluate our beliefs and our thoughts on this thing about the public trust doctrine, and really to take a close look. We tend not to pay attention, I guess, at times about and take for granted that wildlife belongs to all of us, and yet we've allowed captive wildlife to occur, and with it has come its own baggage. And it's just something for folks to sit back. I mean, I'm not going to. I know I sound like I'm preaching one way or the other, but I'm trying not to preach one way or another. I just really think that if you do more reading and more education of yourself on chronic wasting disease and conservation issues such as this, you'll think differently about it.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining us today, Colin. The captive cervid industry is obviously a big part of chronic wasting disease, and I feel like it's something that can be difficult to gain a good understanding of. And so we really appreciate you coming on today and helping illuminate that a little bit further for us.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Colin. Appreciate it. I don't know if you have anything else you want to leave us with before you go.
No, I can't really really say too much more. It just is something that we all have to live with, and we need to get to an answer on how to manage and control, and hopefully someday get beyond this reactive mode that we're in with chronic wasting disease. Yeah.
Well, thanks, man. Keep fighting the good fight.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
The Chronic Wasting Disease Chronicles,
A production of NWF Outdoors and Artemis.